All right, everybody, here is day 1, week 2 of my second mesocycle, warming up with close grip bench presses with a pause. This is my warm-up set. Actually, this is my last warm-up set. Just doing 135, making sure that I'm controlling and owning that eccentric, making sure that when it's pausing on my chest, that I am not letting go of that tension, that I am holding it there with a very light contact and making sure on that concentric I'm exploding up. One thing I hope people take away from watching my videos is that it is important to own every repetition. I don't care if you're a power lifter or a bodybuilder. Making sure that you practice good technique at all times is a must. So here is my first working set. So I will be doing 3 sets, pretty heavy, and then 3 drop down sets. That's where I decrease the weight by 10% and go for more reps. As you can see, now that there's more weight on the bar, I am really emphasizing owning every single repetition. I'm lowering the bar for about 2 seconds. I'm staying tight while the bar is on my chest, and I'm making sure that I'm exploding up. Try to make sure that the bar is coming down nice and evenly. Second key point, guys, is just don't let that bar bounce off your chest. So many guys, really use that stretch reflex to kind of kickstart that movement, and that's really where you start to load that tendon. Actually, when you pause in these positions, you actually take the tendon out of the equation because you're basically dissipating all the elastic energy in those tendons. No tendon in particular, but all the tendons, from the muscles that are using for to perform this movement. So just make sure you stay tight, guys. Like I said, I work in a sports clinic, and I see a lot of injuries, a lot of bad shoulders from people who just really use use really poor technique with heavy weight. And, like I said, at the end of the day, their shoulder ends up suffering. So here I am, drop down the weight 10%. There is no pause for the drop down sets. It's basically touch and go. As I said before, don't bounce. Light contact with your point of reference. It could be below the nipple line. It could be at the nipple line. It could be above it. Everybody's anthropometric dimensions are going to be different. So you want to make sure that wherever your point of reference is, light contact, touch and go. Still emphasizing that eccentric, making sure that you can control the weight on the way down. All right. Now moving on to pec deck flies. So Jared actually wrote dumbbell flies, flat dumbbell flies for me. Flat dumbbell flies are just one of those movements, no matter how I tweak the technique. I do unrolling flies, I change the angles, I change the positions of my arm, the position of my body, and no matter what I do, I always feel it in my shoulder, and I always feel it in my bicep. And it's not a good feeling either. It's not like, my bicep is getting pumped. It's a very, strain type feeling, and I almost never feel it in my pecs. So when it comes to any type of fly or isolation movement for the chest, I will always opt out for cables or pec deck based movements. Now the only exception is steep incline dumbbell flies. That, with a slight bend in my elbow, I definitely feel targets the upper chest a lot for me. But because it's flat dumbbell flies, I basically just threw in this substitution instead. Really felt it in my pecs, really felt a nice deep stretch, and my shoulders, more specifically my left shoulder, was totally fine throughout this set. And guys, don't be so dogmatic when it comes to exercises. Just because something is written doesn't mean it's gospel. If you need to modify things because it feels better, this is bodybuilding. The idea is to feel the exercise doing what it's supposed to. And if you're training your chest and you don't feel it in your chest, something's wrong. So this is my 4th set, programmed 4 sets total. And as you guys can see, I'm really emphasizing that eccentric contraction. I'm really emphasizing keeping those shoulder blades down. A big mistake or movement compensation a lot of people tend to use when they're doing flies is they shrug their shoulders up, which takes the pecs out of the equation, or not completely, but definitely want to make sure that we're maximizing our movement efficiency and keeping those pecs on tension as much as possible. So I make sure I keep my chest up, I keep my shoulder blades down, and I make sure that I emphasize that eccentric contraction, and I make sure that I really stretch it in the back, stretch it to a point where it still feels good on the pecs and it's not hurting my shoulder. You know, if you're somebody who has a little bit more mobility in your shoulders, I would even emphasize maybe limiting your range of motion, because just because you can get into a position doesn't mean you should, especially if it's a weakened position under load. You know, so just watch out for that, guys. All right, third and second to last exercise, dumbbell upright rows. To kind of take the strain off my wrist, I point my thumbs up at a 45-degree angle. I make sure that, as opposed to just thinking of pulling the dumbbells straight up, I think about pulling them up and out. This not only feels good on the shoulders, feels much better on my wrist. You know, this is a great exercise for those posterior and medial delts, and also great for the upper traps. You know, as you can see, just kind of knocking them out, not really emphasizing too much that eccentric, just making sure that I'm getting the work done. And my last exercise, finishing off the workout with some dumbbell curls. No explanation needed, just making sure that I'm keeping my shoulders stacked and packed, keeping them down and back, making sure that as I'm coming up, I'm thinking about turning the pinkies in. That's basically called supination. I mean, my hands are already in a supinated position, but you know, I just want to make sure that I am shortening the bicep as much as possible in this position. I'm getting some slight shoulder flexion, I'm getting full elbow flexion, and I'm getting supination at the radial ulnar joint. You know, if you guys are going to be exercising, make sure that you're maximizing movement efficiency. All right, guys, so if you've been watching my videos for the past week, this is my second week of my second mesocycle. So last week, for my primary exercise on the close grip bench, I did 165 pounds. Today, I used 170 pounds. Now, a big mistake I feel a lot of people make, especially when increasing muscle size is their goal, is that they sometimes sacrifice volume for more intensity, because they have this idea that the heavier the weight is, the more effective it is. Well, in terms of strength development, that is definitely the case. But in regards to increasing muscle mass, it is not. To a certain extent, you want the appropriate amount of intensity, which, you know, in the most strictest terms, is the amount of weight lifted. So there's a certain point where the weight's going to get so heavy that it's just going to affect the overall volume. So you can't maintain the volume needed to elicit the appropriate adaptation. That's why it's so important that it's called progressive overload, and that works for strength training and it works for hypertrophy. You want to incrementally increase the load over the next few weeks. I think a lot of people are very short-sighted in their approach towards hypertrophy, because they think every single workout, you know, the weight has to be heavy, you know, but you have to look at it more like, you know, through time. As long as you're, you know, presenting the appropriate stimulus, you know, which is mechanical tension, in regards to hypertrophy, which means the appropriate amount of intensity to maintain the appropriate amount of volume. You have to, you know, basically metabolic fatigue. You know, this is where the volume comes in. You know, these are where the rep ranges from 7 to 15 are most appropriate. You know, and then you want to make sure that you're using progressive overload, where you're basically increasing those through time. Now, your body doesn't progress in a linear fashion the way that you would want it to, because, you know, there's a lot of things that affect overall recovery, you know, accumulated fatigue, poor sleep, and things like that. But oftentimes what a lot of people do is they shoot themselves in the foot, because, you know, let's say, for example, I had a client and I programmed deficit deadlifts, and the weight I presented to him was 170 pounds. Now, it was his first week, you know, and you know, he said, oh, I put 225 on there because I just had to feel the weight. And I was like, well, how many reps did you do? And he's like, you know, 4 to 6. And I'm like, the rep spread for him, ideally what I wanted him to get was anywhere between 10 to 12 reps. So not only did he cut his weight in half, he may have even hurt the recovery, you know, down the line, because let's say next week, you know, he tries to do, you know, 185 pounds, and now he can't because his lower back is so fatigued, because, you know, he introduced so much mechanical tension that his, you know, erector spinae didn't recover as quickly as, you know, his hamstrings and glutes, not including the fact that he was also squatting that week as well. So, guys, I guess the main thing that I'm trying to, you know, teach you guys is that volume is key when it comes to hypertrophy. If your goal is to get bigger, then you want to make sure that you're presenting enough volume, you know. Make sure that if you're just starting a cycle, you start at the low end. You know, this is mind-numbing for some people, because they just want to go in, they want to do like 5 sets of everything. You know, when they leave the gym, they've done 40 total sets of exercises. Now, that, you know, maybe for some short cycles can be beneficial if you're trying to introduce like, you know, a superfluous overload. But, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it's just, you know, hurting recovery. So it's better to start off low, introduce the most appropriate intensity and weight, you know, and then progress through the volume landmarks. I'll present more information as I go along, but I just felt like that's something that I wanted to tell you guys because, you know, a lot of people, they work against their goals, not with their goals. And I want to make sure that my followers aren't wasting their time. All right, guys, talk to you soon. Take care and have a great day.